Hello YouTube! In this video I'm going to examine Rudolf Carnap's approach to metaphysics presented in his paper Empiricism, Semantics and Ontology. Carnap presents an approach that aims to resolve many of the central disputes in metaphysics. So to give a bit of background here, there are many debates in metaphysics that concern ontology, the question of what exactly exists. For instance, do abstract objects exist? Take numbers. Do numbers exist? Well, mathematical Platonists say yes, nominalists say no. According to the mathematical Platonist, numbers exist. They are abstract, that is to say they don't exist in space or time, they have no causal powers. Of course, objects in space and time can instantiate numbers, so I might have 3 cars or 3 chairs, or I might take 3 sips of water. But we can also consider the number 3 in itself, independent of any specific 3 things. The Platonist says that the number 3 in itself exists. It exists in an abstract realm. Numbers are discovered, not invented, and their properties are discovered, not invented. So we discovered that number 3 is prime, for instance. Nominalists, by contrast, deny that there are abstract objects. So for the nominalist, strictly speaking, numbers don't exist. Now, there are many contexts where it's useful to talk as if numbers exist, but really there are only concrete objects and events. There is only the spatio-temporal world. There isn't literally the number 3 existing in some abstract realm. I have a video where I talk a bit more about Platonism in philosophy of mathematics for more detail on this debate. But this is one of the kind of classic debates in philosophy, been going on for thousands of years. Like, what is the status of numbers? And similar debates arise for other entities, such as properties, propositions, moral values, other mathematical objects, such as sets. So that's the background. Now, before getting into Carnap's view, just a brief advert. If you like this channel, you can support me on Patreon or with a one-off donation on PayPal. I really do appreciate all of the help that anybody can give. These videos take a lot of time, and if anybody can donate anything, it's really helpful. I offer private tutoring. Please email me if you're interested in that, and if you want to talk about any of these topics, join the Discord. The link for all these things will be in the description. Okay, so let's turn to Carnap. Now, Carnap suggests that these classic debates in ontology rest on actually a fairly simple confusion. And to make his case, Carnap introduces the notion of a linguistic framework. So when we want to speak about entities, we have to introduce new ways of talking that are subject to specific rules. And this is a linguistic framework. So a linguistic framework is basically just a fragment of a language. It consists of a vocabulary, so a set of terms, and it consists of rules for how to use those terms. There are formation rules that tell us which sentences are grammatically correct, and then there are transformation rules that tell us how to infer from one sentence to another. So let's take numbers as an example. Well, there are specific rules for using the number language. First of all, of course, we have to introduce numerals. So we introduce symbols like 3 and 5 that are taken to refer to numbers. And then we introduce rules for how to use these symbols. Formation rules tell us which sentences containing number terms are grammatical. So x plus y equals z, that's grammatical. Or there are x things, that's grammatical. On the other hand, if I was to say, like, I don't know, equals plus x, y, z, like that wouldn't be grammatical, right? So we have these rules that tell us which sentences are grammatical, and then we have transformation rules that tell us how to make inferences in the number language. So, for instance, when I can assert that, there is a book, and there is a book, and there is a book, if I can assert those 3 things, then I can assert there are 3 books. So, those are simple examples, but you should see how that works. Now, we can think of the axioms of arithmetic as being sort of transformation rules that specify the relations between numbers. So we have axioms like, for all numbers x and y, if x equals y, then y equals x. Or for all numbers x and y and z, if x is greater than y and y is greater than z, then x is greater than z. Or for all numbers x, if x is a number, then x plus 1 is a number. Now, with these sorts of axioms in place, we can define functions like addition and multiplication. The addition function takes two numbers and maps them to another number. So with the addition function, with 5 and 3 as the input, the addition will give 8 as the result. So this is the framework for talking about numbers. It has immense practical utility. And so that's just that should be fairly simple, right? Like, we just introduce these terms and then we have rules for how to use these terms. So linguistic frameworks consist of definitions plus logical relations that tell us what follows from what within the framework. Now, it's important to see that there's nothing metaphysically loaded here, right? Like a linguistic framework is just a fragment of a language. It's just a way of speaking. So far, we're not making any claims about what exists or what doesn't exist. We just have a bunch of definitions and some rules of usage. That's what a linguistic framework is. Okay, so with this notion of linguistic frameworks in place, Carnap distinguishes two kinds of existence questions. There are internal questions, which ask about the existence of particular entities within the framework, and then there are external questions, which ask about the existence of the system of entities as a whole. So let's start with internal questions. What exactly are internal questions and how do we answer them? So let's consider numbers again, and suppose that we're in a mathematics class and we ask, is there a prime number greater than 100? So does there exist a prime number greater than 100? Now, in the context of a mathematics class, this is answered by straightforward logical analysis. Given the definition of number and prime, and given the rules of arithmetic, we can give a logical proof that 101 is indeed greater than 100, and that 101 is prime. I mean, just imagine how a teacher would demonstrate to her students that 101 is a prime number. That tells us that, yes, right, within the framework of arithmetic, there is a prime number greater than 100. So this is an internal question, right? We're using the framework of arithmetic, and then we're applying logical analysis. We're applying the rules of the framework to come to an answer to an existence question. So if we think about this question, do numbers exist? Well, interpreted as an internal question, the answer is trivial. We've just proven that within the framework of arithmetic, 101 is a prime number greater than 100. So we can give this simple argument, right? We can say, well, look, we've shown that 101 is a prime number greater than 100. This entails that 101 is a number. This entails that there is an x such that x is a number. And of course, that's just to say numbers exist. There are numbers. So when we ask the question, do numbers exist? If that's interpreted as an internal question, it asks whether numbers exist within the framework of arithmetic, whether the framework of arithmetic commits to numbers. And that's easily answered in the affirmative. That's trivial, right? Clearly there's no dispute to be had about this, or so Carnap thinks. So when philosophers ask the question, do numbers exist? This trivial question is not what they have in mind. When philosophers ask the question, do numbers exist? They're not asking whether numbers exist within the rules of the linguistic framework of arithmetic. Philosophers are instead asking a question about the framework as a whole. They're asking a question that is, in some sense, prior to the adoption of the framework. So they will grant that, yeah, I mean, of course there are numbers within the framework of arithmetic, but what interests philosophers is whether this framework as a whole corresponds to reality or refers to things in reality. Like, is there some, is there some independent realm of numbers that is correctly described by the framework of arithmetic? That is where the dispute between the Platonist and the nominalist lies. But as Carnap sees it, this question is nonsensical. So this is what he would call an external question, right? This is a question about, so we're kind of stepping outside the framework and asking about the framework as a whole, right? We're not sort of using the framework at this point. We're kind of trying to make an assessment of the framework as a whole thing. So now we can, in Carnap's view, ask external questions about frameworks, but this can only be the pragmatic question of whether we ought to adopt the framework. So, as Carnap sees it, when we ask, do numbers exist, as an external question, that has to be understood as the question, ought we to adopt the framework of numbers? And to answer this question, we assess how the framework performs with respect to its practical utility. Like, is the framework simple? Is it expedient? Is it useful for prediction and explanation? Does it help us to systematize our theories of the world, and so on? And of course, in this case, with respect to the arithmetic framework, the answer is again yes. Obviously, there are lots of useful applications of mathematics, but this isn't really a factual matter. It's not something, when we sort of make a judgment that we ought to adopt a framework, that's not really something we can be correct or incorrect about. It just depends on our goals. So, like, think about other practical questions, like the question, should I pursue a philosophy PhD? Well, knowing factual knowledge is relevant to this, but ultimately, knowing facts isn't sufficient to answer that question. It depends on my goals and values. What do I care more about? Do I care more about spending time thinking through philosophical problems, or building a foundation for a stable income in the future? Similarly, the practical question of whether to adopt the arithmetic framework depends on our goals and values. So as Carnap sees it, then we have this internal question, do numbers exist, which is just trivially yes. Within the framework of arithmetic, they exist. We can then step outside the framework of arithmetic and then ask the practical question of whether we ought to adopt that framework. But there is no sense to the question of, does this framework as a whole correspond to reality? So, one way that a useful article here by Matti Eklund is the article Carnap and Ontological Pluralism. He draws a distinction between different types of external questions. So he suggests that we can understand Carnap as distinguishing pragmatic external questions from factual external questions. And Eklund gives the example of two people debating the proposition, the tomato is a fruit. So let's say that two people are disputing whether or not it's true that the tomato is a fruit. How should we understand their debate? What could they be debating about? Well, there are three possibilities here. One option is that they are asking whether it is true in our language, in ordinary English, whether the tomato is a fruit. So this is just to ask, is the predicate fruit conventionally attributed to tomatoes? This is, of course, an internal question. We're asking what comes out true in the language that we actually use. What comes out true in ordinary English? What statements are licensed by ordinary English? So that's one thing that they might be debating. Alternatively, they might say, look, we're not interested in actual English. Instead, they might be asking, should we adopt a language like English, except where it comes out true that the tomato is a fruit, or a language like English, except where it comes out false that the tomato is a fruit? So take, for instance, biological classification. In biology, fruit is defined as the seed-bearing structure of flowering plants that forms from the ovary. It's the means by which these plants spread their seeds. In this framework, the tomato is a fruit. Now, take, by contrast, what you might think of as like a culinary classification, the kind of classification scheme used by chefs, where we might say that what counts as a fruit is a matter of what would be acceptable to put into a fruit salad. In that framework, the tomato is not a fruit. So one thing our disputants might be arguing about then is maybe they're arguing about which of these frameworks to adopt. Right, so they might be saying, should we adopt the biological classification framework or the culinary classification framework? Now, this is a pragmatic external question, because in this case, the question is, which language is it useful to adopt? And I mean, the answer to this is just going to depend on what our goals and values are. I mean, certainly, like, so, and that's probably going to depend on what we're trying to do, right? Like, so if I'm a biologist, I'm probably going to go with the biological classification. That has proved to be very useful and practical in that context. Whereas if I'm a chef, you know, the specific details of biology aren't really that important. I'll probably go with the culinary classification. But in any case, you know, it's like we're not sort of really asking like which of these frameworks is really right or wrong. It's just a practical matter which is most useful to us. Okay, then finally we can suppose that the two disputants say that they don't care what comes out true in English. They don't care what comes out true in the language we actually use, nor do they care about the pragmatic question of what language would best serve their goals. They're not interested in languages. They are interested in the way things really are. They are disputing whether the tomato really is a fruit, independently of any particular language. They're interested in which language really gets things right, which language really corresponds to the world. This is a factual external question, or at least it tries to be a factual external question. Now, this third option probably strikes you as a little bit obscure. What possible evidence could bear on the answer to this question? It's not obvious that any empirical investigation or logical analysis could decide the matter. In fact, worse, it's not at all clear that there's even a meaningful question being asked. And indeed, Carnap's view is that philosophical debates about ontology are just like this third question. Philosophers try to ask factual external questions. They try to ask which framework really corresponds to reality, but these questions are just not even meaningful. So the idea then is that the question of whether or not X's exist, that can be asked only within a given linguistic framework, and it is answered by applying the rules of that framework. Do numbers exist? Well, yes, they do within the arithmetic framework, because the arithmetic framework licenses talk of numbers. Then there is the external question of which linguistic frameworks we should adopt, but it makes no sense to ask, independently of the arithmetic framework, whether numbers really exist, whether the arithmetic framework corresponds to some independent reality. As Carnap puts it, and I quote, "To accept the number world means nothing more than to accept a certain form of language. In other words, to accept rules for forming statements and for testing, accepting, and rejecting them." So that's the general idea. It's easy to extend this idea to other classic metaphysical debates. So take ordinary objects. We have a language that describes observable things and events occurring in space and time. I can say that, you know, there's one chair in my room, that I have two hands, that I was born in 1991, that I live on planet Earth and the Earth existed for many billions of years before I was born, that the Earth orbits the Sun, and so on. Philosophers debate whether there really are any ordinary objects like chairs and planets and people. According to mereological nihilists, there are no composite objects. There are no objects composed of parts. There are only arrangements of fundamental particles. There are no chairs, strictly speaking. There are only particles arranged chairwise. Other philosophers hold that ordinary objects really do exist. Again, I have a video which covers a number of the arguments concerning ordinary objects. I will link it in the comments. Obviously, from Carnap's view, this debate is just based on a confusion. When I ask a question like, you know, are chairs real? Do chairs exist? Is there a chair in my room? Well, interpreted as an internal question, these are to be answered by straightforward empirical investigation. There are rules for what counts as confirming or disconfirming the existence of a chair. There are rules for what counts as one thing being inside another. You know, so that by applying these rules, I can figure out whether or not it's true within the ordinary object framework that there's a chair in my room. I make observations, I judge those observations against certain theoretical virtues, and then there are certain observations that license me to talk about chairs. And, you know, so similarly, there are certain observations that would license me to talk about unicorns if I saw a horse-like animal with a horn, but those observations have never been made. Again, this is all totally straightforward. These are internal questions. Then there is the pragmatic external question of, should we adopt the ordinary object framework? I mean, in this case, most people probably don't even recognize a choice in the matter. I mean, we're just all taught the ordinary object framework from the time that we're children, but we could, in principle, abandon it, right? We don't have to keep talking about chairs and planets and people. So should we keep using the ordinary object framework? That question makes sense. But what philosophers ask is not, they're not asking the internal question of what comes out true assuming the ordinary object framework. They're not asking the pragmatic-external question of whether to keep using the ordinary object framework. They're asking the factual-external question: do ordinary objects really exist? Does the ordinary object framework correspond to an independent reality? Again, Carnap would say this is just nonsensical. Or take properties. So within the object language, we can describe what objects are like. I say things such as the ball is red. And what I can do now is take certain terms of the object language to refer to properties of things. Red is a property. So I can say that, when we claim that, by saying the ball is red, this is synonymous in the property framework to saying that the ball has the property of redness. And then I can make inferences like this. I can say, well, if the ball is red and the car is red, then this allows me to assert that the ball and the car share the same color property. And then once we've introduced properties, we can then talk about properties independently of the objects that instantiate those properties. So I can talk about, say, I can just talk about like redness in general. I might ask, what does the color red conventionally represent? Maybe red, in some particular society represents danger. So I might say red represents danger. And when I say red represents danger, I'm not referring to any specific red thing. I'm referring to redness in general, or like how redness in general is viewed by a particular society. So I'm able now to talk about properties in general, rather than just talk about specific things. So how do we determine what properties there are and what things bear those properties? Well, again, by straightforward empirical investigation, applying the rules of the property framework. Do properties really exist? That question is just confused. Now, so we have various frameworks then. Now, what Carnap would say is that introducing new ways of speaking, introducing new linguistic frameworks, that doesn't require any kind of theoretical justification. It doesn't require logical proof or empirical evidence. It doesn't require us to show that anything really exists. Like all that's required is a practical justification. Some linguistic frameworks are expedient, useful, conducive to our aims. Those are the frameworks we will adopt. So to talk about numbers and objects and properties, that has all sorts of useful applications. But again, I mean, like linguistic frameworks, they're just fragments of a language, right? They're just ways of speaking. And you don't have to prove that anything exists in order to adopt a way of speaking. Now, once a linguistic framework is in place, well, then we can start giving, logical proofs or empirical evidence or whatever for the existence of particular entities within that framework. So in the end, Carnap favours a kind of Platonism, but it's a deflationary Platonism. Carnap would say, yeah, numbers exist, properties exist, objects exist, but their existence is a trivial consequence of the linguistic frameworks that we've adopted. Moreover, for Carnap, there is no a priori constraint on which linguistic frameworks to adopt. So Carnap proposes a principle of tolerance for new linguistic frameworks. The basic idea here is just that we shouldn't allow metaphysical speculation or metaphysical ideology to prevent us from using languages that have practical utility, right? So, like we shouldn't allow, these nominalist philosophers who deny that there are abstract objects. Well, don't allow that kind of metaphysical speculation to prevent us from adopting really useful frameworks like arithmetic. So, as Carnap sees it, look, people can suggest new linguistic frameworks whenever they like. They have to specify the vocabulary and the rules of the language, and then it's just a matter of seeing whether it has practical utility. So as Carnap says, and I quote, "Let us grant to those who work in any special field of investigation the freedom to use any form of expression which seems useful to them. The work in the field will sooner or later lead to the elimination of those forms which have no useful function." Okay, so that's the general idea. Now, this sort of approach has become a fairly popular view, I think, in the recent literature on metaphysics and ontology. There are quite a lot of philosophers now who have been inspired by this general idea. So what I want to do now, though, is turn to some challenges to this position. Okay, a first challenge is that although Carnap wants to avoid traditional metaphysical positions, we might think that his view actually commits him to some sort of like global fictionalism or global constructivism or even idealism. So to see the problem here, recall that for Carnap, the introduction of linguistic frameworks does not require theoretical justification because it does not imply any assertion of reality. When we talk about accepting new entities, say accepting the existence of numbers or properties, this amounts to nothing more than adopting a new linguistic framework, a new way of speaking. Now, Carnap is explicitly not realist about this. So Carnap will say, yes, numbers exist. Yes, statements such as 101 is prime, those statements are true. I mean, we can even say that, yes, numbers are mind independent. I mean, certainly that's something that's going to follow, within the framework of arithmetic, or at least the framework of arithmetic does not sort of treat numbers as being dependent on our minds or anything like that. But of course, all of these statements are made internal to the framework of arithmetic. Carnap, as Carnap himself says, and I'll quote him here, he says, "We may still speak of the acceptance of the new entities, since this form of speech is customary. But one must keep in mind that this phrase does not mean for us anything more than the acceptance of the new framework, i.e. of the new linguistic forms. Above all, it must not be interpreted as referring to an assumption, belief, or assertion of the reality of the entities. There is no such assertion. An alleged statement of the reality of the system of entities is a pseudo-statement without cognitive content." And then a bit later he adds, "The acceptance of a linguistic framework must not be regarded as implying a metaphysical doctrine concerning the reality of the entities in question." Now, so the worry is this. On this kind of picture, it seems that what we have are just linguistic frameworks, where accepting a linguistic framework implies no assertion of reality, but then it looks as if, the world and its contents are just made up by us, right? Like what there is just a matter of what languages we choose to speak. Now, of course, this will be false within a given framework. So within the framework of arithmetic, it's not the case that numbers are invented by us. Within the framework of arithmetic, numbers are abstract objects. They don't exist in space or time, so they're never invented at all. But the framework of arithmetic itself, that was invented by us, and that's something that we choose to continue using, and that's the case for all frameworks. So the thought is here. Well, isn't Carnap going to be committed to the idea that there's nothing beyond our all there is linguistic frameworks. There's nothing beyond our frameworks, and so we kind of make up the world. We make up reality by inventing and adopting linguistic frameworks. Now, I mean, Carnap might object at this point that to sort of put things in this way is to be seduced into asking a factual external question. So if the assertion of the reality of a system of entities is a pseudo-statement, then the denial of the reality of a system of entities is also a pseudo-statement. Right? If it's a pseudo-statement to say that numbers really exist independently of us, then it's a pseudo-statement to say that numbers are really invented by us. The problem, I think, here is that, I mean, Carnap himself would surely grant that linguistic frameworks are invented by us. So it may well be a pseudo-statement to say that numbers are invented by us, but it isn't a pseudo-statement to say that the language of arithmetic was invented by us. I mean, clearly languages are invented by human beings. And Carnap's model seems to entail that our choice of language fixes what there is in some important sense. So one way to kind of push this problem is to consider a case that everybody would agree is fictional. So suppose there are some children playing a game of make-believe. They have a set of terms referring to the activities of pixies and a set of rules for the use of those terms. Let's say that there's a tree stump that is a prop in their game, and the rules of the game include the idea that the tree stump is magical, and whoever sits on the tree stump is the pixie queen, and thereby has the right to order the other pixies around. So when Verity sits on the tree stump, it is true within this framework that Verity is the pixie queen. And of course it follows from this that pixies exist. So the question, do pixies exist, interpreted as an internal question, that is clearly answered in the affirmative. And, you know, I mean, this is a perfectly well-defined linguistic framework, and in fact it may have a lot of practical utility for the children. There's you know, good reasons to engage in make-believe like this. But I mean, we'd presumably say this is just made up. This is a fiction. The pixie world is a constructed fictional world. So the challenge here is that, on Carnap's view, all linguistic frameworks, all assertions of reality, ultimately seem to have the same status as the pixie framework, and you know, all assertions of reality ultimately seem to have the same status as the assertion of the reality of pixies within the pixie framework. Now, our ordinary object framework and, you know, arithmetic framework and so on, they might have greater practical utility, but none of these frameworks are really getting at the facts. Indeed, you know, like there are no such facts to get at. Facts can only be described within frameworks. So the challenge is that, you know, I mean, if we think that the pixie framework is just fictional, then it seems like we're going to have to say the same about all of these other frameworks too, and so that's going to commit Carnap to a global fictionalism. Okay, a second challenge here concerns conflict between frameworks. It's part of the pixie framework that the tree stump is magical and whoever sits on the tree stump becomes queen of the pixies. But now consider the ordinary object framework of common sense. Well, it's part of this framework that there are no pixies and that the tree stump is just a tree stump. Or consider our ordinary moral framework. It's part of this framework that tree stumps are of no moral significance. Sitting on tree stumps doesn't give you the right to order other people around. Now, it's important to note that it's not just that these frameworks make different commitments to the pixie framework. The frameworks comment on each other. The ordinary object framework explicitly tells us that the pixie framework is false. I mean, that's why when I was introducing the pixie framework, I called it a game of make-believe. Here's another case of framework conflict. Consider the framework of anti-numbers. So /1 is an anti-number, and an anti-number, so anti-numbers are used for counting, just like numbers are, right? So I can kind of say like /1, /2, /3, and then I can say things like there are /3 apples, and so this is the basic use of anti-numbers. But by definition, this is just by the definition of the linguistic framework, anti-numbers are such that no other mathematical operations can be performed on them, so they're only used for counting, and moreover they are incompatible with the existence of numbers. So it follows within this linguistic framework, it's true that there are /3 apples, but then it's going to follow within this linguistic framework that the number 3 doesn't exist. Now, I'm just describing the rules of the framework of anti-numbers here, and it seems to me that this framework is, again, perfectly well defined. It has rules that are very simple, very straightforward. Everybody could figure out how to use this framework. But like now we have a case of framework conflict. The anti-number framework explicitly tells us numbers don't exist, which of course conflicts with the number framework. So the question then is, okay, how do we deal with cases where frameworks conflict? So we have, framework F1 says that pixies exist, F2 says that pixies do not exist. The natural next question is, which framework is right? Do pixies exist or not? Now, of course, Carnap will say, well, this just comes down to the pragmatic question of which framework we want to use. But there are two problems here. The first problem is, what if I decide to use both frameworks? Now, this problem may not have been pressing for Carnap because he was a logical empiricist. He was particularly interested in scientific theorizing. He was interested in engineering frameworks that could serve scientific inquiry. In the context of scientific inquiry, obviously we will strongly favor frameworks that do not conflict. And part of the reason for that is just because it seems to be one of the central goals of scientific inquiry to construct a unified systematic theory of the world. So we put high importance on frameworks that are going to, serve the goal of systematic theory. So when we detect a conflict between frameworks, well, of course, we just alter the frameworks to remove the conflict. But science is not all that matters to us. And in fact, Carnap himself, I think, would have granted this. As far as Carnap was concerned, our goals and values could be anything imaginable. So I need not care about developing frameworks that are mutually consistent. In fact, in principle, I might have the singular goal of developing linguistic frameworks that pose as much trouble as possible to Carnap's approach to ontology. Just on a more sort of everyday basis, though, we're not always engaged in scientific inquiry. There are lots of other things that we might want out of life. For children, for instance, play is important. So, they're going to come up with the Pixie framework, and it doesn't really matter that much that this framework conflicts with the ordinary object framework. That doesn't really pose any problems for them because they're not trying to construct a unified systematic theory of the world. So, given their goals, they have now these two conflicting frameworks. So here's the situation. F1 says that there are x's and that F2 is mistaken. F2 says that there are no x's and that F1 is mistaken. Let's suppose that both F1 and F2 have practical utility, and I don't have any particularly strong reason for developing frameworks that are all mutually consistent. Now, so it serves my goals to use both frameworks, and I'm not particularly concerned about the conflict between them. Now, the question is, do x's exist? Well, distinguishing the internal from external questions doesn't really help here. So it's like, x's exist according to F1, x's do not exist according to F2, but I'm using both languages, and now it seems like a perfectly sensible question to ask, well, which framework is right? And so it's not really clear, like, what, how I'm to proceed here. Like, am I committed to x's or not? Now this brings us though to a second problem, which is this example arguably challenges the very distinction between internal and external questions. So notice that what's going on here when we talk about the Pixie framework and the ordinary object framework is that the ordinary object framework is making a factual external assertion with respect to the Pixie framework. So, in the ordinary object framework, tree stumps are not magical is an internal truth. But if we believe that, if we get on board with that, then it looks like we can assess the Pixie framework as a whole. We can assess the Pixie framework from the point of view of the ordinary object framework, and we can make we can then make the factual external claim that the Pixie framework is false. Now that claim is factual external with respect to the Pixie framework. It's internal with respect to the ordinary object framework. So I make the internal claim that within the ordinary object framework, I make the internal claim that the Pixie framework is false. But with respect to the ordinary object framework, that is an internal claim. But with respect to the Pixie framework, that is a factual-external claim. But again, Carnap wants to say that these sorts of factual external claims are meaningless. So the general problem here is it seems to be part of the framework, or it seems to be an aspect of some of our frameworks, that they ask factual external questions about other frameworks, or they make factual external claims about other frameworks. So it is an internal claim of some frameworks that other frameworks are true or false. And then it seems like these factual external claims are not meaningless by Carnap's own standards. So, you know, if we adopt the principle of tolerance, if we adopt this idea that, you know, we should be tolerant to what we should just allow people to develop frameworks, like as long as you've got a well-defined vocabulary and specific rules for usage, you can say whatever you want, then it's not clear why, how we can rule out making claims about other frameworks that are external with respect to those frameworks. Okay, another problem here is discussed by Florian Steinberger in his paper, How Tolerant Can You Be? So, according to Carnap, we cannot decide between frameworks in terms of which is, you know, really correct or incorrect. Instead, our decision is made on practical grounds. Now, in assessing the practical utility of frameworks, we have to appeal to certain standards that tell us which framework is better given our goals. If our goal is to develop a unified systematic theory of the world, then we want to have reasonable beliefs about which frameworks will achieve that. You know, we don't just guess. So, as Steinberger says, the process of framework selection ought itself to be guided by rational norms of some sort. When we choose a framework, we don't want to be deciding on a mere whim. We want to actually rationally assess which framework is going to best meet our goals. Now, Steinberger points out a problem here. What exactly is the source of the norms by which these frameworks are judged? Well, according to Carnap, norms are given within frameworks. I quote, "We impose such norms upon ourselves by adopting a linguistic framework that gives rise to them." It makes no sense to ask, or it makes no sense to suppose that there are framework independent norms. It makes no more sense to suppose that than it does to suppose that there are framework independent things of any other kind. So rational norms, like everything else, are specified only within some framework or other. But then we have to step outside our frameworks in order to assess which framework to choose. In which case it looks like the decision to accept a framework can't follow any norms at all. It can't be subject to any sort of rational constraint. It actually can only be made on a whim. So as Steinberger puts it, linguistic frameworks define internal standards of acceptability for our modes of inference. However, our choice of the framework itself is an external matter that is not subject to those standards, or indeed to any theoretical standards at all. So a natural answer to this problem is to say that when we are selecting different frameworks, we must always presuppose some other framework. That is, we never suspend all frameworks and judge from a framework-independent position. So I can choose between F1, F2, and F3, but then I'm making this choice from some other framework, F4. I mean, in fact, this is a pretty plausible view, given that Carnap treats linguistic frameworks as fragments of a language. Whenever we debate which language to adopt, we will be using some language to have that debate. I mean, usually ordinary English. So, following Steinberger, we can call this further framework the selection framework. A selection framework is a framework that is assumed when selecting between other frameworks. Unfortunately, this runs into a problem. Let's suppose that there is a selection framework, SF, that supplies the norms that guide us in choosing between frameworks F1 and F2. So we're assuming SF, and then we're sort of applying the norms that are supplied by SF to ask whether to go with F1 or F2. At this point, the question of whether to select F1 or F2 becomes an internal question. It is an internal question of SF. It's not an external practical question. So SF consists of a vocabulary, a set of norms, a set of rules, and then applying the rules of SF, it delivers the result that we ought to adopt F1. So then we ought to adopt F1 is an internal assertion of SF. And so now, again, it looks like the internal-external distinction has dissolved. Now, Steinberger does suggest a solution to this. So Steinberger says, what the Carnapian should say here is that selection frameworks do not actually answer the practical question of which framework ought we to accept. Instead, they only answer the theoretical question, which framework best satisfies some goal. So we can specify what our goals are, and then we can ask which framework best realizes those goals. So our goal might be to construct a simple, consistent, systematic theory of the world. Then we can ask, okay, which frameworks are simpler? Which frameworks are consistent with each other? And so on. But having recognized that a particular framework best satisfies this goal, it's a further matter whether we actually adopt the framework, and that's not something that a selection framework can tell us. As Steinberger puts it, and I quote, "A selection framework does not dictate which ends I ought to pursue. It merely specifies rules governing my means-end reasoning once I have decided to pursue that goal." Of course, the difficulty with this response is why exactly selection frameworks would be barred from telling me what I ought to do. Why would they be barred from answering the practical question, which framework ought we to accept? Again, this seems to be just straightforwardly incompatible with Carnap's principle of tolerance. I mean, surely I could propose a new way of speaking. I could give, perfectly well-defined terms, perfectly clear rules of usage. So I could propose a new linguistic framework which licenses sentences about what we ought or ought not to do. And then that could serve as a selection framework, and then it will be an internal assertion of that framework that we ought to adopt F1. So if we go with this kind of response, then it looks like, again, we're gonna have to give up on the principle of tolerance. We're going to have to figure out some way of, barring selection frameworks from telling us what we ought and ought not to do. Okay then, a final concern for the Carnapian is the regress problem. So let's consider the question, what exactly is it that makes internal statements true or false? So we say that the proposition 101 is a prime number. We say that this is true within the framework of arithmetic. But what makes it true? Well, Carnap would say it's true within the framework of arithmetic because it follows from, the terms that are used in the arithmetic framework and the rules for using those terms. It follows from the axioms of arithmetic. So what makes internal statements true or false is just a matter of the rules of the relevant framework. But the worry is that actually figuring out what follows from the rules of a particular framework is already going to presuppose a particular interpretation of that framework and particular rules of inference. So to see this, imagine that I was to accept the proposition A, and I was to accept that A entails B. So I accept the conditional if A then B. So I accept A and if A then B. But then I just refuse to draw the conclusion B. So this is obviously very strange, right? People don't usually reason in this way, but there could be, right? There could be somebody who just doesn't follow these, what to us are just very basic and obvious rules of inference. There could be somebody who's like, yep, I accept A and I accept A entails B, but I'm just not going to accept B. There's a very nice short paper by Lewis Carroll called What the Tortoise Said to Achilles, which talks about how we can justify these basic rules of inference, and it's very nice. It gives an example of a fictional character who is like this, who refuses to make this this inference. So I accept A, I accept that A entails B, but then I deny B. So I accept the vocabulary and rules of framework F1. I accept that given the vocabulary and rules of F1, 101 is a prime number, but then I just refuse to draw the conclusion that 101 is a prime number. And yeah, I mean, why not, right? In order to draw the conclusion that 101 is a prime number, so in order to draw the conclusion that within the arithmetic framework, 101 is a prime number, I need to have a commitment to more general rules of inference. Rules such as, when I accept A and I accept if A then B, then I infer B. But those rules of inference are not given, they're not themselves part of the number framework. They're much more general rules of inference. So when we ask the question, okay, what is it that makes internal statements of F1 true or false? Right? What is it that makes it true in F1 that 101 is a prime number? Well, it's not F1 just in itself. It's also going to involve some higher level framework that supplies these more general norms of reasoning, these more general rules of inference. So these general rules of inference allow us to infer what follows given the vocabulary and rules of F1. Now, for Carnap, as we've seen, the choice of framework is a practical question. In order to answer this practical question, so in order to tell whether F1 or F2 best meets our goals, obviously we need to determine, well, what does F1 say? What does F2 say? And then we can figure out, so once we know what the framework says and we can think about what consequences the framework would have if we were to adopt it, we can answer this practical question of which framework to adopt. But then, how do we determine what a given framework says? How do we determine what a given framework is committed to? Well, as we've seen, this is going to require the application of more general rules. So to determine what F1 says, I have to appeal to some more general, higher level framework, SF. SF supplies rules like, so if you assert A and you assert if A then B, then you infer B. But now it seems that what F1 says is an internal assertion of framework SF. So let's say then that I introduce some other framework for assessing what F1 says, SF star. SF star does not use common rules of inference like modus ponens, right? SF star uses some really weird alternative logic. So we end up with the situation that according to SF, F1 says that P, according to SF star, F1 says that not P. So according to SF, the arithmetic framework says that 101 is a prime number, but according to SF star, the arithmetic framework says that it's not true that 101 is a prime number. Okay, so what F1 says, what F1 is committed to, will turn on whether we assess it in SF or SF star. What does F1 really say? What is F1 really committed to? Well, that would be a factual external question, so on Carnap's view, would make no sense. At this point, there's only the practical question of whether to adopt SF or SF star. But now we face an obvious regress, because now we've got to determine, well, what does SF say and what does SF star say? And that can only be an internal question of some higher level framework, SSF, right? So I've just claimed that according to SF, F1 says P, and according to SF star, F1 says not P. But actually, these are claims about what SF says and what SF star says, and these claims, in order to assess those claims, I've got to appeal to some further framework, and so we're off on a regress. So the worry is there's actually no way of there's no kind of ground here. There's no way of even assigning any kind of content or meaning to these frameworks. We're just left in a position where we actually can't make any sort of pragmatic assessment. We don't even know really what any framework says, what any framework is committed to. We don't know that the number framework tells us that 101 is prime. So that may be a problem. Okay. That is the end of that. That was Carnap's approach to ontology and some of the potential challenges to it. I hope you found that interesting, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye, everybody.